What evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
This is the Shadow.
My hypnotic power has clouded your mind.
The Shadow!
Yes, the Shadow.
I'll be there in every empty room, as inevitable as your guilty conscience.
Because her name is Justice. Her revenge for your mockery will be death.
Agents of the Shadowcast, report for the only podcast on the internet devoted exclusively to the immortal exploits of the Dark Avenger. Before we begin, a lot has occurred since our last episode, and as such, I want to offer a solemn tribute to the late great comic icon Denny O'Neil, who strangely was the subject of the last episode of the Shadowcast, wherein we covered the 70s Shadow comic series from DC, and sadly, after what is reported to be a lengthy illness of some kind, he has now passed from this mortal shade. Now, Denny O'Neil is flawed, yes, and I acknowledge those flaws, we'll get to them, but still sacrosanct to me in terms of his overall place in the sort of macrocosm of comicdom. Most will laud him for his tireless work reinventing Batman as the Dark Knight in the 70s, which in many ways was simply a realignment to his 1940s pseudo-shadow roots, shall we say. But to me, he may well be my favorite Daredevil comic writer, which the only other character I like as much as the Shadow. One of my absolute favorite Daredevil graphic novels of all time is Love's Labor's Lost, written by Denny O'Neil and illustrated by the excellent David Mazzucchelli. It was the perfect lead-in for Frank Miller's perennial classic Daredevil Born Again in the mid-'80s, and probably for that reason, just a bit overshadowed in the public consciousness at large, but I highly recommend that you go pick it up and read it. I think it's on Amazon. It was one of the first Daredevil graphic novels I ever read, and I still love it to this day. But here on the Shadowcast, I'm sure we'll all remember Denny O'Neil for far darker things, namely his reinvention of the Shadow character, effectively introducing him to the entire modern generation after a 20-year publication pause following Street and Smith's demise in the mid-50s, preceded by the cancellation of the Shadow magazine, I don't know, like a half-decade previous. It may have been brief, and it may be imperfect. Certainly Jim Steranko found enough issues with Denny O'Neil's interpretation of the Shadow that he outright refused to work with him on the 70s Shadow comic. But the Shadow from DC was nevertheless massively important in resurrecting the character after a lengthy hiatus, allowing him to remain more or less perpetually in print ever since. It's no exaggeration to say, without Denny O'Neil and, yes, Mike Kaluta, who knows if we'd even remember this character at all? The Shadow knows, of course, but look, this wasn't even my introduction to the character in comics. I was, actually, a bit of a personal anecdote here. I was volunteering at a food bank in 2003, and on the side, they were taking in, like, book and comic book donations from local Phoenix businesses. And so a local comic shop was consolidating its stock, and it was my job as sort of the resident comic geek to sift through all the comics to discern which would actually be appropriate for the children these were intended for and what would not, because not all comics are intended for children, as we know. And then I saw it. A pristine hardcover collection of Marvel Epic's The Shadow 1941 Hitler's Astrologer. It looked awesome. It involved a vigilante wasting Nazis, and the artwork was exactly what I was looking for at the time. I love Art Nouveau, and that sort of influence in comics was what I was looking for. I'm in the vocal minority who believe this comic features the finest art Mike Kaluta ever created, differentiated primarily by the pristine penwork of inker Russ Heath, who we recently lost as well, I think a couple of years ago. I'll review that comic in full at a later date, but suffice to say I was hooked right from the beginning. I read it cover to cover in a single evening and was instantly thirsty for more, and so began my long and winding journey into the Shadow. I have my issues with O'Neil, as I referenced before. Just because I lament his passing doesn't make him perfect. Some of his views on the nature of politics in comic books border on those of a propagandist, and that shouldn't be diminished.
Green Arrow tells readers that a moral cancer is rotting America's soul. The well-meaning Green Lantern is accused of being a racist.
My theory was that it was probably too late for my generation, but maybe you get a real smart 12-year-old and get him thinking about racism.
I find some of those ideas pretty odious, all of which can perhaps be best seen in his ideologically charged Green Lantern, Green Arrow comics. He also did some of that in The Question, which I have some pretty serious issues with, considering his interpretation of the character was basically a massive middle finger to Steve Ditko, who created the character for deeply personal philosophical reasons, and then Denny O'Neil sort of threw that back in his face with a complete contradiction of the character's intent. It always sat badly with me, and I'm sure sat with Steve Ditko in no kindly fashion, who he also passed away recently. Sadly, we're losing a lot of legends. Those Green Lantern and Green Arrow comics have just aged like fine milk. And I don't think he's the best Shadow writer in the sense that he isn't the most locked into the mythology of the pulps. I'll always have a bit of an issue with how he's seemingly covered up for Bill Finger's plagiarism by writing the whole "you're my greatest inspiration" bit in Batman number 253, I think. But he was seemingly a company man. He was with DC for a long time. He did jump back and forth to Marvel a little bit, but overall he was a DC company man, and that's what company men do. Sadly, he helped sweep that under the rug for many, many years until Anthony Tollin and Will Murray really uncovered that. But he's still a hugely important figure in the revivification of the Shadow, and certainly a titan in the reinvention of Batman, and a writer of unparalleled importance in the comic medium at large. Thank you, Denny O'Neil, and rest in peace. Which brings us at last to today's episode, where we will review arguably the crowning achievement of the Dynamite Comics incarnation of the Shadow, one which only recently came to a somewhat ignominious end after Cy Spurrier's appalling attempt at a reboot in 2017. And like most readable Dynamite Shadow comics, this one involves Matt Wagner, the sorta kinda not really origin story, The Shadow Year One. Now, normally Matt Wagner writes and illustrates his own work, but this particular one was a slightly different story. He wrote this one, but did not illustrate it. Uncommon for him. Now, Wagner isn't perfect. He does, like pretty much right off the bat, he sadly succumbs to the historical slash-fic syndrome I've bemoaned in so many other instances in modern Shadow comics. It's one thing to write about historical events. Maybe this is just something that's incumbent to any period comic or any period story. But it's one thing to write about a historical event. It's another entirely to imbue your protagonist with a modern sensibility toward those events. So it seems like there is a character from 2019, a character from 2020, who has been plopped into events from 1940 and is judging those events through the prism of someone from 2020. The reason I resent this so much is, are we to presume, especially looking at the state of the world around us, that we have it all figured out in 2020? That we have isolated the way social and political issues should be? Do we really? Looking around at the state of our society, are we really going to pass judgment on the residents of the year 1940 or the year 1930, where many, many things about our society worked a lot better? That I always kind of have that resentment whenever I detect that, and unfortunately, Matt Wagner falls prey to that a little bit. It's, Gerard Jones fell prey to this in The Shadow Strikes. Love that comic, but he did. Michael Uslan's The Shadow Green Hornet was one sustained exercise in this trope, and now in The Shadow Year One, we are almost immediately dropped into the Cobalt Club. So I don't know why this always seems to happen in Cobalt Club scenes. I guess because a bunch of rich people get together And so comic writers with an axe to grind are like, oh, it's time to judge some rich people from the 40s. But, Lamont Cranston gets to clue us all in on the true dangers of the Great Depression, racism, and the World War over a decade before some of it even happened. It's political, it's cringe, more importantly, it's lazy. It's lazy writing. But fortunately, it also isn't ubiquitous, at least not in this particular story. Dark Knight's totally different story, but there's a lot of different things going on in this one. Original Shadow agent Harry Vincent is nowhere to be found. That's probably one of the most immediately identifiable aspects. Instead, as usual, we've replaced him with Margot Lane. Kind of creates a strange continuity issue, because as we know from the pulps, Harry Vincent is basically the first full dedicated field agent. Burbank just kind of chills and deals with radio equipment, and every now and then he'd trail someone. Claude Fellows is sort of the headquarters man, the guy passing information back and forth between people. And Harry Vincent was enlisted as sort of the foot soldier. Later on, we get more. So it kind of creates a strange continuity problem where Margot Lane apparently was enlisted before Harry Vincent in this sort of kind of not really origin story. Very, very, very odd. Once again, we've got Margot Lane. It's handled well, although yet another high-class escort backstory for the character is doing her no favors. That's getting a little tiresome. This is not the first comic to do this. The romance is handled well, I have to say, and I like how Wagner finds a way to keep the Shadow remote and mysterious while allowing for a love story as well. I don't think the Shadow needs that element for the record, and the story might even be better without it, but I do think he handled it about as well as a human being conceivably could under the circumstances. I say it might be better without it, not because I have any aversion to the Shadow being romantically involved with Margot Lane, but because it gives rise to the framed narrative and resultant Frank Miller comic book captions that utterly obliterate the pacing of the plot in places. And look, I'm not picking on Matt Wagner here. This is simply a malady the comic industry indulges in far too often, I find. What do I mean? Well, let's say two people are having a conversation, but one of them is telling a story in clunky caption bubbles at the same time. So Mel says, "Hey, Mike," and Mike says, "Hey, Mel," and the grim, dark 80s comic caption says, "It was a dark and stormy night. I could smell Mel's aftershave like pork rinds and formaldehyde." "So where are you going, Mike?" "Over the movies, Mel." "The movies hadn't been good for 40 years, but I still made a point to go. Even if they were unentertaining, it's important to get out at times. Plus, my popcorn bag gave me dollar refills until the damn thing disintegrated." I hate the very fabric of this trope. And the Shadow Year One is swimming in it at times. As the Shadow's waste and wops on a rooftop somewhere, Margot Lane's chiming in with, "Oh, he's so dreamy. I sure was ovulating just watching him commit homicide." It just breaks up the pacing of the plot, and every scene would be better without it. It's like trying to watch a movie and your girlfriend is holding an entirely separate conversation in your ear the entire time. It almost never adds anything of merit, and I can scarcely imagine a modern comic that wouldn't be drastically improved if all the information in the caption bubbles wasn't cleaved out entirely and put into plot. Now, I appreciate a lot of things about this story. I appreciate this ostensible origin story does not include Shiwan Khan. It would have been all too easy to lapse into that syndrome, and we do come perilously close during the Tong War at the latter portion of the story. But fortunately, Matt Wagner is wise enough to feature his all-new antagonist, Dr. Zorn, instead. I like Dr. Zorn. Dr. Zorn's a weird one. He feels pulpy enough. I like his look. But he does kind of feel like a Nazi character that isn't actually a Nazi because the time period wouldn't have allowed it, right? Like almost as if Matt Wagner made Dr. Zorn before realizing that the Shadow's origin would have to take place over a half-decade before Hitler was even involved in German politics, and sort of like had to write his way backward so he'd be a German in World War I instead. Like, I like Dr. Zorn, but it feels like there's a bit of missed potential here. The psychic superpowers stuff I could do without. It's not very Walter B. Gibson. Yeah, Walter Gibson always seemed to find a way to have a legitimate explanation for the seemingly supernatural. The idea of Zorn being some psychic vampire attracted to Kent Allard's id is as hokey as it is clunky. They get a little bit of mileage out of it. It also feels kind of tacked on. The Shadow Gear 1 is a curious dichotomy in that it's an ideal introduction to the Shadow, and yet kind of an awful origin story. Like you would think it, based on the Shadow Gear 1 name, that it would be a pure origin story, but it's really not. Like in fact, all the true origin aspects of this story are divulged through awkward expository sequences rather than through actual plot. There's more actual concrete origin for the Shadow character in Michael Uslan's The Shadow Green Hornet Dark Knights, in fact, which is weird and makes me wonder if, like, maybe Matt Wagner didn't have an entirely different script already written, and then maybe Dynamite asked him to make it an origin, so he sort of folded all those elements in after the fact. I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, but it's weird. It's an origin story that isn't an origin story. But look, Matt Wagner is clearly a fan of the pulps and knows a fair bit about them. I don't know how many of the pulps he's read, but he clearly has some knowledge, because there are some great pulp nods. What with, Kent Allard being revealed as the Shadow's true identity, Stanley the chauffeur, which is somewhat insultingly turned into a clunky, like, I don't know, racism caricature. For those who are unaware, calling Lamont Cranston's chauffeur Stanley in the pulps was a reference to Walter B. Gibson's own childhood chauffeur Stanley, who was most certainly an old, kindly white dude. But, yeah, hey, Matt Wagner wanted to wedge in an awkward line of dialogue late in the comic about how Margot has to warn the police of an incoming gang war because if Stanley had done it, white cops wouldn't take a black guy seriously. Like, ugh! You can see what I mean when I say modern writers tend to project modern mores onto a 40s time period. Like, as good as Wagner is, he's definitely one of those, unfortunately. But it's kind of cringe to see him just rewrite Stanley like that for no apparent reason. There's other pulp references, as we include Claude Fellows as the Shadow's insurance man, cum intermediary, and there's a brilliant bit of reveal at the end where, spoiler alert, the reporter who's been hunting the Shadow all story is revealed to be Maxwell Grant. The pen name, of course, for Walter B. Gibson and for Theodore Tinsley and Bruce Elliott and all the different writers who wrote Shadow stories in the 30s and 40s. Although, again, it's a bit weird, given that if you really break this down, he's basically given a role that already exists in the pulp stories. The role of Clyde Burke. But whatever, it's still a neat Easter egg. You just could have had Clyde Burke in that role. I guess you couldn't technically, because Clyde Burke came along later. You get weird continuity things going on here. You almost feel like Matt Wagner had a story written and then sort of realized there were continuity conflicts. Like, for instance, there's a Tong leader later on who is being influenced by the psychic influence of Dr. Zorn, and he starts dressing like Shiwan Khan. I am almost certain that Matt Wagner intended for that to be Shiwan Khan, or some such. But of course, he realized, okay, Shiwan Khan was introduced later, and that is canonical in the pulp, so I literally can't do that. I have a feeling this story may not have been blocked out properly beforehand as well. As I seem to recall, it was originally advertised as being a shorter miniseries. I forget how many issues. It's like maybe 8 or something. Might even have been less, like 6 or 7 issues. Then randomly Dynamite rolled out an announcement saying it was now going to be 10 issues. Always an indication that maybe the story wasn't blocked out properly, which I think it needs, but not for good reasons. Matt Wagner wastes a lot of time on Margot Lane labia rattling at Kent Allard for 2 or 3 issues and kind of a cringy romance before we really press on with the plot proper, and it almost seems like he just suddenly jams a conflict between Zorn and the Shadow in at the 11th hour to wrap it all up. The sort of demise of Dr. Zorn, I also have a slight issue with. I feel like I'm complaining a lot here, but it's an excellent story. I have to nitpick because the merits are so evident. We'll get to those, though. The final conflict with Dr. Zorn and the Shadow is really emblematic of the problem with a lot of modern Shadow everythings. Not just comics, but just all modern Shadow media. The great The great thing Walter B. Gibson was able to do with the Shadow was he didn't just kill the bad guy. The bad guy didn't just die. Usually. I mean, sometimes you would just shoot him and he'd slump over dead at his desk and that was it. But usually he would find some way to sort of bring the theme of their offense full circle. He would square the scales philosophically and morally in the process of killing the guy. You know, if the guy was selling drugs or he was poisoning people, maybe the guy would wind up ingesting poison. In fact, that just happened in one of the Shadow novels that I just read, right? The Shadow would visit the evil of evil people back upon them. And that's one of the character's great contributions to this sort of vigilante fiction. It's almost not a vigilante character, it's more a revenge character. Like, it's more revenge fiction in a weird way. All too often with modern writers, it's like they just mistake him for a 1940s Punisher. Oh, it's just shoot 'em up time. He drops into a room and he starts shooting bad guys. And that's... You know, the Shadow is a stealth character. If this were a video game, he would be a stealth character. He'd be the guy who sneaks around. And he can certainly hold his own in a fight. But honestly, the regular gangsters have gotten the best of him in some of the pulp stories. If he's surrounded by enough bad guys, he gets shot, he gets wounded. That does happen in this. And it happens at the 11th hour, of course, in like the 9th issue. He gets finally shot by a henchman. But it's, you know, it's sort of a gunfight that he didn't need to engage in, but he just drops in, boom, 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 boom. You know, it's like Garth Ennis did this a whole lot. There's just a ton of the Dynamite writers think that's all there is to the Shadow. Oh, he's got 2 guns and he shoots lots of people. Ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. And unfortunately, we literally end with a fist fight on top of a train between the Shadow and Dr. Zorn while they have a psychic taunting session. I mean, some of it's kind of cool. I do like, he does bring it morally full circle in the sense that Dr. Zorn is manipulating people mentally. And so the Shadow finds a way to pry into his brain and starts manipulating him. There is that. I don't want to sell Matt Wagner completely short, but ending it with a regular old boxing match on top of a moving train is kind of silly. Not very Walter B. Gibson, but maybe a little bit Theodore Tinsley, to be honest. But that's selling Matt Wagner a little bit short because Matt Wagner's real strength and what really sells this comic is in his Shadow voice. He really gets how this character speaks and what his motivations are, Margot Lane's gash notwithstanding. And he wisely imbues Dr. Zorn with a similar air of the theatrical, leading to some brilliant exchanges between the two. Like the initial reveal where he shouts something like, "It's time to suffer the perilous prognosis of Dr. Zorn." Oh, it's a fine bit of back and forth too in I think it's the 9th issue. He says, I'll quote right now, "I was once like you, enraptured by a cause, spurred by a belief, but my service to the Kaiser left me broken and alone. Finally I realized salvation lay not in the so-called enlightenment of your precious tulkus and monks, but in war, the very chaos that birthed me. I live now only to weave its sweet desolation. Misery, you see, is my redemption." To which the Shadow replies, in uncharacteristically pithy fashion, might I add, "Only death can absolve your many sins, Snow Tiger, and I am the vessel of your deliverance." Absolutely genius purple pulp dialogue. This is why you get Matt Wagner to write a Shadow comic. And I hope he has another crack at it whenever the next company gets a hold of the Shadow comic book license. As you guys may or may not be aware, Dynamite lost the license. Basically, all the licenses for the Shadow stuff have been called in. I talked in a previous podcast about how that may indicate that they are possibly going to make a push for a new wave of Shadow media. So probably means the licenses will be given out to a bunch of other people. They've done this periodically. Condé Nast have, going back to the 70s, honestly, even before that with the 60s Archie comics version of the Shadow. But they tend to have a big wave of a lot of media all at once. They tend to sort of greenlight a lot of TV and movie projects and comic books at the same time, so they can have just sort of try and flood the market with a lot of Shadow stuff and a lot of dark. They've done this with Doc Savage as well, rather. And I'm sure they'll do it with the Avenger and whatever at some point. But it looks like Condé Nast, fingers crossed, guys, may be gearing up for another push with the Shadow. The Shadow Year 1 is sort of emblematic of the last major push, and that was when they gave Dynamite the comics license. Dynamite went to town on Shadow Comics, and some of them are really good, some are not so good. On balance, I think Dynamite were pretty good for the Shadow character. I don't think they were that bad. I think for the most part they did good by it, but they published some of the best Shadow comics I've ever read, and they published a couple of the worst, to be honest. You can't lie. You have to be honest about these things. The Simon Spurrier Shadow reboot is among the worst comics I've ever read. Never mind Shadow comics. It was really bad and had terrible art too. It wasn't just the script. I mean, the artwork of it didn't really work. The artist wasn't a very good storyteller. Great covers on it, man. Total waste of Mike Kaluta's talents, unfortunately. But really not a very good comic. And speaking of the artwork, here in the Shadow Year 1, Wilfredo Torres. He was never my favorite Shadow artist, but he does an admirable job here, crafting a kind of Batman the Animated Series look to a story that in retrospect really benefits from that approach. It's grown on me, for a fact. I think I may have recorded a video before where I said I wasn't that big of a fan of it. It seemed like it was farmed out to someone who was cheap. But, in retrospect, this artwork has grown on me. I think Torres did a pretty good job, but he takes some rather obvious shortcuts in places. As a firearms aficionado, I can't help but notice, the Shadow's pistols keep morphing and changing grips, and even which model of 1911 they are keeps changing from panel to panel. Not a big deal if you don't know much about guns, but you can tell, he was 10 issues deep, and he was really trying to haul ass here. In fact, there's a couple panels where, a car will flip or something, and it'll just look like chicken scratch. It doesn't even look like a car. You can tell he was really rushing. It's mostly toward the very end. All in all, Torres has a very strong sense of storytelling, and people would probably heap even more praise on these interiors if they weren't so overshadowed by some of the finest cover art Alex Ross has ever painted in his career. And that's saying something, guys. I mean, this stuff is exceptional, even by Alex Ross standards. So good, in fact, I don't know if you guys noticed, he included a full video trailer of his Shadow paintings on the official Alex Ross YouTube channel recently. He nails Lamont Cranston, and his Shadow looks exactly like what you expect. To me, he's like a modern George Rosen. If Condé Nast ever get their act together and start publishing some new Shadow prose novels, Alex Ross needs to be the cover artist. No excuses, people. If anyone has his number, you call him today. The Shadow in general, I think another thing I have to compliment Matt Wagner on is you're dealing with gang wars and sort of 30s and 40s mobsters. It would have been really easy for that to devolve into sort of Francis Ford Coppola kind of cliche or whatever. We could just turn into like The Godfather or something, or some knockoff thereof. But brilliantly, I think, he gives every single mobster their own distinct sound and voice. There's a particular mobster who's called the Dandy, who you can tell he has sort of he likes to project an air of pretense that he's sort of this upper class gentleman, and so he'll say something like ain't, and then he'll catch himself and say is not, and he's sort of trying to affect a high class demeanor. I really enjoy that, and all the mobsters seem to more or less have that. You can tell, though, there's sort of some repetition going on here. Structurally, I wonder if Matt Wagner wasn't rushing, just like Wilfredo Torres was a little bit, because he reuses Margot Lane being thrown off a building, or about to be thrown off a building. Like, really? You're mobsters? You can't think of any more creative way than throwing her off a freaking building? I don't understand that at all. But it does allow us to have one of the coolest set pieces in the history of the Shadow in comics, where he flies in on his auto gyro complete with like gray ghost goggles from Batman the Animated Series, and swoops in with twin 45 automatics blazing. I mean, it is a classic Shadow moment, one of the definite highlights of the Shadow Year One. In general, I would highly recommend this comic. It's really good, if a little bit leisurely paced. Like I said, not much in the way of an origin story, but as an actual introduction to the Shadow, it still works stunningly well. If you're a fan of the pulps, you'll probably get even more out of it. But even some of those pulp references are a little bit strange and reworked and sort of modernized. So one wonders what Matt Wagner was really going for in terms of his overall audience. I think Matt Wagner would do better. Personally, later on, we'll talk about the Shadow, the death of Margot Lane. I think that, to me, is maybe the apex of the entire Dynamite Comics run of the Shadow, and sadly didn't sell very well because it was right at the very end when you could tell Dynamite's interest in the character and everything was just running out of steam. They didn't put much advertising into it. They didn't really care. It seemed like they were focused more on that Batman the Shadow crossover that was so utterly awful. But anyways, like, in general, I highly recommend, if you guys, a lot of people ask me all the time, what would be the best way to get into the Shadow? Well, first off, if you find a good Shadow comic, any Shadow comic is good to get into. The 70s Shadow comic is great. The Shadow Strikes is a really good introduction to the character. But really, in terms of a modern comic that is still in print, at least for now, because they did lose the license, I think for the next year they're allowed to print Shadow comics, but they can't publish any new ones, if that makes sense. The Shadow Year One would have to be my recommendation. It's still available on Amazon for a reasonable price, and it is definitely a great starting point for any prospective new fans of the Shadow, ladies and gentlemen. Good art by Wilfredo Torres, a very strong story from Matt Wagner with some issues that I pointed out. Matt Wagner would do better, and Wilfredo Torres, I don't know if he ever worked on the character again, but really, really good job all around here for the Shadow Year One. This being Dynamite Entertainment, probably one of the main events, are all the covers. And I talked about the Alex Ross ones, but oh my gosh, like, they had 4 or 5 different artists all doing a series of their own covers across 10 issues. And some reached 10 issues, some didn't. Chris Samney, who did Daredevil, the awful Mark Waid, Chris Samney Daredevil run that I'm not a fan of. But Chris Samney is a good artist, and he did a really, really good job with the Shadow Year One covers. In fact, those might be my favorites, even more than the Alex Ross ones. I would love to see a Shadow cartoon series or something in that similar style, sort of an angular, very noir, very sort of binary light and shade kind of look. I really, really enjoy that. So it's almost German expressionist in a weird way, but with a dash of sort of cartoony. Really, really love those covers from Chris Samney. I know that Howard Chaykin also did a series of covers. He was working on the Shadow Midnight in Moscow right around the same time, which at some point I will make it my priority to review, because I've actually never sat down and read that one. But the guy I think who deserves honorable mention for his Shadow covers here on the Year One is the writer himself, Matt Wagner. I think some of the best covers in this series, honestly, are from Matt Wagner. A few are kind of pedestrian. I mean, you know, oh, hey, it's the Shadow, and he's holding guns up. Wow, in the darkness. Not great, but there's a really cool one of him perched on top of a train. I mean, there's some really cool ones. Him, you know, peeling back a curtain, I think, and stepping through. There's some neat little Matt Wagner covers here, and, you know, Matt Wagner gets this character. His artwork can be an acquired taste. If you're not a fan of Grendel and the artwork in that, the work that he did there. You might not dig his shadow artwork, but he does a pretty good job here. Whatever else you want to say about Dynamite, and certainly there's a lot positive and negative that you could say, they did finally give the Shadow the ideal introductory volume. That's really what you cannot take that away from Dynamite Entertainment. I have my issues with them. Certainly the way it ended was, a bit of a whimper, you have to say. It's certainly ripe for criticism. But one thing the Shadow had lacked for decades was an ideal introductory volume. I mean, think about this. Prior to the Shadow Year 1, if someone asked you, okay, how are you going to start reading the Shadow, what will you have to say? The 70s Shadow comics from DC that are really hard to track down and have never been collected in full graphic novel form. I mean, there was from the private files of the Shadow or whatever. That's kind of cool, but it only reprints like the first 5 or 6 issues. It's not even a complete reprinting of the 70s Shadow comics, so that doesn't even work. Like, what would be the ideal introduction in a comic book sense? Maybe the Shadow in the Coils of Leviathan or something, or there's a lot of different things that you could recommend, but up until now there was no ideal introduction to the Shadow until the Shadow Year 1, and for that alone we at least have to be somewhat grateful to Dynamite, however their run ultimately ended. Well, that does it for this installment of the Shadowcast. In fact, it ends this inaugural season of the Shadow. Seeing as we were doing Prominent first, this of course is the first origin story in the history of the Shadow. Next season, I'll give you a little hint, is going to be a little bit more pulp oriented, and we should have a lot of fun going through those, especially for a lot of people who haven't read the pulps and want to know what some of the stories are, to sort of get you into the character. So until we begin next season on the Shadowcast.
The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.